The town had learned long ago how to recognize a man who didn't quite belong. He wasn't loud about it. He had dressed strangely or felt his ideas in the square. He was subtler than that. He paused when others hurried. He watched when others assumed. And when winter arrived hard, unquestioned, unfamiliar, he treated it not as a season to endure, but as an opportunity to prepare. Every year, the same rhythm ruled their lives. Winter froze the lake solid, thick enough to walk across without fear. Children skated on it, horses crossed it, and men cut small chunks of ice for their cellars, knowing full well it would all be gone by the time summer reached its peak. Ice was a gift with an expiration date. No one argued with that. No one needed to. It was as accepted as sunrise and rot. He was different. While others celebrated the freeze as a relief from mud and insects, he measured it. He walked the lake, its edge at dawn, testing the thickness with a steel spike, listening to the sound it made when it struck. He marked spots with quiet precision, returning again and again until the ice reached the depth he wanted. People noticed, of course. In a small town, everything unusual becomes public property. Someone joked that he was planning to build a glass house on the lake. Someone else laughed and said he must be waiting for it to talk back. He ignored them. When the cold settled deep enough that breath hung in the air like smoke, he began cutting. Not the thin slabs people usually hauled home, but enormous blocks clear, heavy, dangerous to handle if you did, to respect their weight. He worked alone most days, scoring the surface carefully, sawing slow and steady, levering the blocks free with tools he had modified himself. It was exhausting work, the kind that burned muscles and numbed fingers at the same time. Still, he did T-rush. Each block was shaped with intent, lifted with ropes and sleds, dragged away from the lake while others stopped to stare. They expected him to bring the ice to his cellar. That, where ice went, underground, in the dark, until it wept itself into water and disappeared. But instead, he hauled it past his house, past the road, to the far edge of his land where a deep pit waited. That alone was enough to spark rumors. The pit had taken weeks to dig, wide and carefully sloped, lined with timber supports that suggested planning rather than impulse. People had asked what it was for. He had answered simply that he needed space, nothing more. Now they watched as the truth emerged, and it made no sense at all. He lowered the first block into the pit with slow precision, settling onto a bed of something pale and fibrous. Sawdust, the kind carpenters swept away without a second thought. He spread it thickly, packing it into corners, smoothing it with his gloved hands as if tucking in a child. Then came another block of ice. More sawdust, again and again, layer by layer, until the pit resembled a strange frozen lasagna, white ice alternating with dull, dusty insulation. That was when the laughter really began. Sawdust was worthless. Everyone knew that. It burned fast and dirty, made a mess, and soaked up moisture like a sponge. It was something you got rid of, not something you relied on. Children threw handfuls of it at each other. Stable boys cursed it when it clogged drains. And here he was, burying precious ice in it like a man who did. To understand the first thing about heat or seasons. Men leaned on fences and shook their heads. Someone called out that he demade himself the world, as cold as compost heap. Another said the spring sun would turn it all into a swamp. A few laughed harder than they needed to, the way people do when something challenges a belief they did. T realized they were protecting. Winter was temporary. Ice was temporary. Anyone who thought otherwise was either ignorant or insane. He said nothing. He finished the last layer carefully, piling sawdust high until the ice vanished completely from sight. Then he covered the pit with heavy wooden planks, sealed gaps with straw and clay, and weighted everything down with stones. When he finally stepped back, his beard was stiff with frost, his hands cracked and red. He looked tired but not uncertain, not even a little. That unsettled some of them more than the sawdust. In the weeks that followed, winter tightened its grip. Snow buried roads, roofs sagged under its weight, and life shrank inward. But the image of that pit lingered. People brought it up over meals, at the tavern, while repairing tools. Each retelling grew more exaggerated. Some said he had filled the pit with rubbish. Others claimed he was trying to preserve winter itself. A few insisted he must have lost someone to hunger in the past, that this was grief turned sideways. The truth was simpler, but no one asked for it. He continued his routines as if nothing unusual had happened. He gathered more sawdust from the mill, thanking the workers who were happy to be rid of it. He checked the pit after heavy snowfalls, clearing drifts from the cover, making small adjustments that no one else noticed. When questioned, he offered no grand explanations. He spoke of air, of dryness, of barriers. Words that sounded technical and unconvincing to people who trusted tradition more than theory. Spring, when it came, was late and aggressive. Ice on the lake groaned and cracked, retreating from the sun day by day. Streams swelled, cellars flooded, and the familiar anxiety returned. Meat had to be eaten quickly. Milk turned fast. Everyone accepted the inconvenience as the price of survival in a hard place. Everyone except him. Someone eventually dared him to open the pit. Not out of curiosity, but mockery. They wanted to see the mess, to confirm what they already believed. He did. Take the bait. He said it was tea time yet. That answer alone fueled more laughter. Of course it was tea time. It would never be time, because there would never be anything left to show. Yet even then, as the ground softened and birds returned, something strange became impossible to ignore. His house smelled different. Cooler. Fresher. On warm afternoons, when others sweated through their shirts, he worked calmly, unbothered by the heat. He did tea boast. He did tea explain. He just waited. And beneath layers of sawdust and silence, winter remained exactly where he had put it. By the time word truly settled into the town, as bones that he was serious, winter had already shaped itself into habit. Snowdrifts stood like walls along the road, and the lake had become a white plain so familiar that people forgot it had ever moved. The pit behind his land was no longer a novelty, it was a joke with a name. Children called it the cold grave. Men passing by spat into the snow and said he was burying effort where sense should have been. And still, the wagons kept coming. Sawdust arrived first in small sacks, then in loads so heavy the axles creaked. It spilled out in pale clouds when dumped, coating the ground like a second snowfall that smelled faintly of pine and iron. The mill workers were happy to see it go. It clogged their floors, caught fire too easily, and soaked up every drop of moisture it touched. To them it was a nuisance. To him it was a resource. He shoveled it with care, spreading it evenly, letting it settle before packing it tight with wooden boards. He worked slowly, methodically, the way a man does when he is building something meant to last longer than opinions. People asked him why sawdust, and they never liked the answer. He talked about air trapped between fibers, about stillness being the enemy of heat. He explained how wet things rotted and dry things endure, how snow itself insulated the ground beneath it. His words slid past them like smoke. They had seen sawdust burn. They had watched it swell and rot in the rain. They had swept it into piles and cursed it. Experience, they believed, was proof enough. What they did, to see, was how he prepared it. Every load was dried further, spread thin in the shed when needed, turned with a shovel until it was light and loose again. He kept it away from ground moisture, away from leaks, away from anything that could compromise its purpose. When he layered it over the ice, he did tea-dump it carelessly. He guided it into place, filling gaps, ensuring no hard surfaces touched. The ice never met air directly. It was always cradled, protected, isolated from the world that wanted to undo it. That care was what unsettled people the most. Madness, in their minds, was supposed to be wild. Loud? Sloppy? This was none of those things. This was deliberate, intentional, and intention made it harder to dismiss. So they laughed louder, more often as if volume could replace certainty. The pit grew heavier with each layer. The walls creaked under the weight, but the timber held, braced by angles calculated with quiet foresight. He checked for settling adjusted supports, and added more sawdust where compression threatened to create empty spaces. The work left his back aching and his hands raw, but he felt a strange calm while doing it. This was not guesswork. This was something he had turned over in his mind for years, shaped by observation rather than tradition. The town noticed another thing too. He never rushed. While others hurried to finish winter tasks before storms, he moved at a steady pace, unconcerned with comments or schedules imposed by anyone else. That patience was read as stubbornness. Some said he was proving a point no one had argued. Others said he was simply lonely and needed something to believe in. A few, quieter voices wondered if there might be something to it, but they kept that thought to themselves. When the pit was finally full, he did tea celebrate. He covered it again, sealed it tighter than before, and marked the date on a small board nailed to the shed wall. 18 months. That number meant nothing to anyone else, but to him it was a promise, not a prediction. Winter dragged on. The novelty faded. The pit became just another oddity in a town full of them. But the sawdust kept showing up everywhere else too. People began noticing how much of it there was, how often it had been wasted. It blew into fences, drifted against walls, piled up behind the mill. The idea that it could serve a purpose any purpose felt wrong, like trying to drink soup with a fork. One afternoon, a group of boys dared each other to dig into the pit. They did get far. The boards were heavy, the stones heavier. When he caught them, he did shut. He just replaced what they demoved and told them that some things only worked if left alone. The seriousness in his voice did more than anger ever could. They left and did tea return. As weeks passed, the pit began to disappear under snow. That ironically pleased him. Snow was another layer, another barrier. Where others saw inconvenience, he saw reinforcement. He stopped by after storms, brushing off excess weight, checking that nothing had shifted, always careful, always quiet. People stopped asking questions and started making statements instead. They said spring would teach him. They said the sun was patient but thorough. They said sawdust would turn to sludge, that water would find a way, that rot was inevitable. These were not cruel predictions, just confident ones. Nature, after all, had always won before. What they did, to understand, was that he was trying to defeat nature. He was cooperating with it. He knew heat moved. He knew cold lingered when given the chance. He understood that most losses came not from force, but from exposure. The pit was not a challenge to the seasons, it was an agreement with them. Winter gave him ice. He simply asked it to stay a while. By the time the first signs of thaw appeared, the darkening snow, the dripping eaves, the pit had become a symbol of foolishness to some and stubborn hope to others. But no one could deny this. The man who built it had changed the way they looked at what they threw away. Even if they were right, even if it all melted into nothing, he had forced them to notice the value hidden in waste. And somewhere beneath layers of pale dust and packed earth, the ice waited unchanged, while the town waited for proof of its disappearance. Spring never arrived gently in that place. It came like an argument that had been delayed too long, breaking out all at once. Snow withdrew in uneven patches. Roofs began to drip in steady rhythms. And the lake, once solid and unquestioned, started to speak again, groaning and cracking, as if waking from a long, resentful sleep. People welcomed the change with relief, but also with a familiar unease. Spring meant mud, rot, and the slow loss of everything winter had preserved. It also meant the beginning of the end for ice. Every year followed the same pattern. The last usable chunks were rationed carefully, saved for meat or medicine, then finally surrendered to water and warmth. By the time fields softened enough to work, ice was a memory. No one expected anything different. No one, except perhaps one man at the edge of town. At first the pit was forgotten. Buried under snow, it had vanished from daily conversation. But as the ground softened and the white cover shrank, it began to reappear, not dramatically, but stubbornly, the dark outline of boards emerging from the melt. Children noticed first. They pointed it out while splashing through runoff, their boots heavy with mud. Adults followed their gaze, and old jokes resurfaced, thinner now, worn from repetition. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking. It was time. They came not as a crowd, but in small clusters, drawn by the same quiet curiosity that pretended to be certainty. They expected to see a soggy hole, a collapsed experiment, proof that sense had once again beaten stubbornness. No one admitted they hoped for anything else. Hope would have required them to imagine being wrong. He met them without ceremony. There was no smile, no defensiveness. When asked, he nodded and reached for the tools he had prepared weeks ago. A crowbar, a shovel, a bucket. He moved like a man performing a routine he had rehearsed in his mind 100 times. The first board came up with effort. It was heavy, swollen slightly from moisture, but intact. Beneath it lay sawdust, darker than before, compacted and damp at the surface. Someone snorted. Of course it was wet. Of course it had failed. But he did stop. He scraped away the top layer carefully, setting it aside. The smell was earthy, not rotten, fresh, almost. Pine and cold soil. He removed another layer, then another, working slowly, deliberately, as if speed might spoil something fragile. The crowd shifted. The laughter softened. Then the shovel struck something solid. The sound was unmistakable. Not wood, not earth. A dull, sharp resistance that rang through the handle and into his hands. He set the shovel down and brushed the sawdust away with his gloves. The white surface beneath was smooth, translucent, and unbroken. Ice. For a moment, no one spoke. Breath hung in the air, though the day was mild. He cleared more, revealing the edge of a block. Its corners softened slightly, but its body intact. When he tapped it with the iron head of the shovel, it answered with a clean, glassy note. Someone reached out and touched it, then pulled their hand back as if stung. It was cold. Not cool. Cold in the way winter remembered. Murmurs spread, low and uncertain. This was supposed to happen. By every rule they understood, by every lesson learned from years of watching ice surrender to time, this should have been water by now. But there it was, silent and defiant, beneath a blanket of what they had always considered useless waste. He did. Look at them. He focused on the work. He lifted the block with practiced care, wrapped it, and set it aside. Beneath it, more sawdust. Beneath that, another layer of ice, just as solid. The pit breathed out cold air, a faint mist rising as the warmer spring air met something it was ready for. They watched, stunned, as block after block emerged, some smaller, some slightly clouded, but all unmistakably ice. Not a miracle, not magic, just persistence given form. The town, as certainty, cracked right there, like the lake under spring sun. Questions came fast then, tumbling over each other. How long? How deep? How much? He answered calmly, without triumph. He explained that the top layers had suffered the most, that loss was inevitable but slowed, that the sawdust had absorbed moisture, trapped air, reduced contact. That cold did, vanish had escaped, and only if given a path. They listened differently now, not with the half-smiles reserved for nonsense, but with the focused attention of people realizing they might have missed something important. Word spread quickly, faster than the thaw. People who hadn't tea come hurried over, expecting exaggeration, finding proof instead. By evening, the pit had become the center of the town as conversation, not laughter this time. Calculation. What could it mean to have ice in spring? In summer? The implications unfolded slowly, then all at once, food lasting longer. Fewer illnesses, less waste. A kind of control over a season that had always dictated terms. He replaced the top layers carefully after removing only what he needed. He did not empty the pit. That, too, was deliberate. He wanted it to continue, to prove not just that it could work, but that it could last. As days passed and the sun climbed higher, the pit remained cold. He opened it occasionally, never for long, always resealing it with care. Each time, the ice greeted him like an old promise kept. The sawdust darkened further, but it held. It did exactly what it was meant to do. The town changed subtly in response. People began paying attention to things they had ignored before. They noticed how snow lingered under drifts, how cellars stayed cool when properly sealed, how wind mattered more than sunlight. These were not new facts, but they were newly respected. Not everyone was convinced. Some said it would. Tea lasts through real heat. Some insisted it was a fluke, a perfect alignment of cold winters and mild springs. Skepticism did. Tea vanished, it evolved, but it was no longer comfortable. Doubt had to work harder now. And beneath it all, beneath the conversations and recalculations, the ice remained, quiet, patient, waiting for the true test that summer would bring. Spring had asked its question, and the answer had been colder than anyone expected. Summer arrived without apology. It came in long, unbroken days where the sun seemed to linger deliberately, as if testing how much the land could bear. Fields baked hard between rains, wood swelled and creaked, and the air grew heavy enough to make even small movements feel deliberate. This was the season that humbled certainty. This was the season that took what winter preserved and demanded payment in sweat, spoilage, and loss. In past years, summer had always been a time of compromise. Milk soured quickly, meat had to be salted or eaten fast, and illnesses crept in when food overstayed its welcome. People adjusted their habits around decay, not comfort. Ice was something spoken of in memory, not practice. By midsummer, even the thought of cold felt distant. Except now, there was the pit. At first, no one mentioned it openly. It hovered in conversation like something improper, too strange to acknowledge without tempting disappointment. But as days grew hotter and cellars turned damp and warm, eyes drifted toward the edge of town where sawdust and timber hid something that defied the season. He did not advertise. He never opened the pit in daylight when others could gather. When he needed ice, he went early before the heat settled, lifting just enough for his needs and sealing everything again with the same careful patience. But absence in a small town is as noticeable as display. People began to realize that while they sweated and rationed, he did not. The change was subtle at first. His food did not spoil as quickly. His milk stayed fresh longer. His movements remained steady even during the hottest afternoons, when others retreated indoors or moved with irritation. These things were noticed, then discussed, then measured against the memory of spring. Eventually, curiosity overcame pride. The first to approach him did so cautiously, offering trade rather than questions. A cut of meat for a small piece of ice. He agreed without comment, wrapping the ice carefully and explaining how to keep it shaded, how to limit exposure. The meat returned to his table fresher than usual, and the story returned to the town faster than the man who told it. Soon, others followed. The pit was no longer a joke. It became a quiet resource. He never sold ice cheaply, not because he sought profit, but because waste offended him more than hunger. Those who came learned quickly that care was part of the price. They were instructed, corrected, sometimes refused. The ice did not leave his hands without knowledge traveling with it. Summer intensified, as summers do. The sun climbed higher. Rain came in brief, violent bursts that steamed off the ground. Wood warped. Iron burned the skin. The lake shrank and darkened, a reminder that cold had truly retreated. And still, when the pit was opened, cold breathed out. People stood farther back now. The laughter was gone entirely. In its place was a careful silence, the kind reserved for things that challenge order. Some watched with awe, others with something closer to resentment. If ice could last this long, what else had they been wrong about? He explained when asked, though he never simplified for comfort. He spoke of insulation, of surface area, of why the pit was deep and not wide, why the sawdust had to remain dry at the core, even if the outer layers darkened. He talked about patience, about resisting the urge to check too often. His explanations were not speeches. They were fragments, offered only when requested, and only as much as needed. The pit lost ice, of course. He never denied that. Heat was relentless, and time always collected its due. But loss was measured now, not assumed. Each block removed was accounted for. Each inch of melt observed and recorded. The remaining ice shrank slowly, stubbornly, like a winter refusing to admit defeat. The town adjusted in small ways. Salt was used more sparingly. Food was stored with greater care. People began to see summer not as an enemy, but as a force that could be managed with enough understanding. It did. To make the heat easier, but it made it less absolute. Not everyone was pleased. There were those who had laughed the loudest in winter, and they struggled the most now. Admitting usefulness felt like surrender. They dismissed the pit as a novelty, claimed it would fail any day now. They said it worked only because he watched it obsessively, because he had no family to distract him, because he had nothing better to do. These explanations comforted them more than truth. Yet even they noticed when sickness declined, when fewer children fell ill from spoiled food, when markets stabilized. Benefits have a way of ignoring pride. By the height of summer, the pit had become a fixture in the town's mental map. It was no longer strange, it was referenced, planned around, depended upon. And dependence carries weight. People began to wonder what would happen if it were damaged, if fire or flood reached it. They suggested protections, improvements, they spoke of building their own. He listened but said little. Late one afternoon, when the heat was thick enough to feel like fabric, he opened the pit in full view for the first time. The crowd that gathered did so quietly, almost reverently. The sawdust was dark and heavy now, compressed into a dense blanket. Beneath it, the ice was smaller, edges rounded, but undeniably present. Someone counted the months aloud. Someone else whispered the number as if it were fragile. He removed a block, held it up to the light, and for a moment the sun fractured through it, breaking into pale rainbows that scattered across the pit walls. It was beautiful in a way no one had expected. Not because it was ice, but because it was defiance made visible. He replaced the cover carefully, sealing the cold back into darkness. Summer did not end that day. Heat continued. Crops struggled. Time moved forward as it always had. But something fundamental had shifted. Ice was no longer bound to winter alone. It had crossed a boundary people had never thought to challenge. And as the longest days slowly began to shorten, the pit remained, breathing quietly beneath its layers, waiting for the next season to test its limits. By the time the first hint of autumn crept into the mornings, the town had already begun to change in ways no one would have admitted aloud. The air cooled just enough at dawn to remind people of what relief felt like, and the long, punishing grip of summer loosened its hold. Fields still demanded work, but the sun no longer felt cruel. Nights grew longer, and beneath layers of sawdust and earth, something colder than memory still endured. That was when the fear started. It did not arrive suddenly, and it did not announce itself as fear. It came disguised as concern, curiosity, and practicality. People began to ask questions that carried weight rather than wonder. How much ice was left? What would happen if the pit failed? Could it be expanded? Could it be copied? These were not idle thoughts anymore. The pit had crossed a threshold from experiment to infrastructure, and infrastructure makes people nervous. The man at the edge of town noticed the change immediately. He heard it in their voices when they approached him, saw it in the way their eyes measured the ground around the pit. They were no longer watching for failure. They were watching for loss. Autumn brought the first real accounting. He opened the pit and took inventory with care, measuring the remaining blocks, noting the melt that had occurred during the peak of summer. There had been loss, yes, but not the kind that destroyed the system. The core remained solid, dense, cold, enough to matter. When people learned this, disbelief turned into something quieter and more unsettling. Respect. Respect carries with it an unspoken admission that one person understanding has surpassed the group. In a town built on shared labor and shared hardship, that imbalance felt dangerous. Knowledge, once proven useful, became something others wanted access to and control over. They began suggesting improvements. Stronger covers, deeper pits, stone linings instead of timber. Some offered help. Others offered money. A few framed their interest as civic duty, arguing that ice preservation should belong to everyone now that its value was clear. He listened. Always he listened, but he did not agree easily. He explained that copying the pit without understanding would lead to failure. That depth mattered. Dryness mattered. Patience mattered most of all. He warned against opening too often, against layering carelessly, against assuming that more effort automatically meant better results. His words frustrated those who wanted simple instruction. They were used to systems that could be memorized, not principles that required judgment. As leaves turned and the air sharpened, winter preparation resumed with new urgency. People repaired roofs, stacked firewood, salted roads. But now there was another task whispered about in barns and kitchens, building ice pits of their own. Some tried. A few dug shallow holes, lined them with straw or cloth, filled them with ice and hope. They failed quickly. Water pooled. Ice vanished. They cursed Sawdust and muttered about exaggeration. Their failures only deepened the unease. If it worked for him and not for them, then the difference had to be something more than material. It had to be method. And method, when mastered by one person alone, creates distance. Winter returned earlier that year, as if eager to reclaim what summer had tested. Frost came hard and clean, sealing the ground overnight. When the lake froze again, thick and clear, the man returned to it with familiar tools. But this time, he was not alone. They watched him work. Not mockingly, as before, but with the focused attention of apprentices who did not yet know they were apprentices. He cut ice as he always had, slow, precise, deliberate. He selected blocks with intention, leaving others untouched. He explained little, but those who observed carefully began to see patterns. How he tested thickness. How he chose clarity over size. How he rejected blocks with fractures invisible to untrained eyes. The pit was reopened fully for the first time since its creation. Old ice met new ice in the same dark space, separated by fresh sawdust. The contrast was startling. The older blocks were smaller, edges softened by time, but they were still there. Still solid, proof not of luck, but of endurance. Someone finally said it aloud. If ice could last this long, it could last longer. That idea landed heavily. Longer meant beyond one cycle of seasons. Beyond 1 year. It meant planning that stretched further than most people dared to think. It meant security. With that realization came the sharp edge of envy, not the loud, angry kind, but the quiet sort that hides behind praise. People complimented his ingenuity while privately resenting the simplicity of it. Sawdust, a pit, patience, things they had always had but never combined. The man felt the shift keenly. He had not intended to unsettle anyone. His goal had never been recognition or control. He wanted only to prove something he believed was true. That truth, once proven, had grown larger than him. As winter deepened, he continued to refine the system. He adjusted the thickness of layers. He altered the slope of the pit walls to manage pressure. He kept records, simple marks on wood, dates scratched into beams tracking time and loss. He did not share these notes, not out of secrecy, but because he knew they would be misunderstood without context. People began to speculate. Some said he was planning to sell ice year-round. Others whispered that he meant to stockpile it for himself alone, a private defense against scarcity. None of these were true, but fear has never required truth to thrive. The second winter passed, and spring followed it as inevitably as before. This time, when the thaw came, there was no laughter waiting for it. There was only anticipation. They counted the months carefully now. 12 had already passed. 13. 14. Each time the pit was opened, the same ritual unfolded. Careful removal. Quiet observation. Muted amazement. The ice continued to retreat, but slowly, so slowly it felt intentional. By the time the 18th month approached, the town held its breath without realizing it. Conversation stalled. Work slowed. Everyone, even those who denied caring, felt the weight of the approaching proof. If ice could survive that long, then the old rules were not laws at all, just habits mistaken for certainty. And habits once broken never return quite the same. The day the 18th month arrived did not announce itself with ceremony. There were no banners. No gatherings planned in advance. No official acknowledgement that something remarkable was about to be tested. Yet from the moment morning light touched the roofs, the town moved differently. Conversations lingered. Tasks were delayed. People found reasons to pass near the edge of town, to slow their steps, to glance toward the place where sawdust and earth guarded a quiet challenge to everything they thought they knew. The man woke early, as he always did. For him, the day carried weight, but not excitement. It felt more like the closing of a long sentence, the moment when a thought finally reached its period. He ate simply, checked his tools, and stepped outside into air that was neither cold nor warm, but balanced and in between that suited what was about to happen. He did not call anyone. He did not need to. By the time he reached the pit, people were already there, not in a crowd, but in a wide, respectful ring, leaving space as if the ground itself deserved room to speak. Faces were serious now. This was no longer curiosity. It was reckoning. The cover came off slowly. The boards, weathered by seasons, creaked but held together. Beneath them, the sawdust lay dark and compacted, heavy with the history of time and moisture. He knelt and pressed his hand into it, feeling for warmth. There was none, only a deep, steady cold that did not rush out but waited. He began to remove the layers. Each shovel of sawdust revealed another story. The top layers were damp, clinging together in clumps. They had taken the brunt of the world, his insistence that ice should not exist here anymore. He set them aside carefully, not discarding them, because even spent insulation had value. Beneath that, the sawdust lightened in color and texture. It loosened. It breathed. Then the first edge appeared. It was not dramatic, just a line, clear, pale, unmistakable. He brushed it with his glove, and the sound it made was enough. Ice does not forget itself. Even diminished, even rounded by time, it announces its presence without apology. A murmur rippled through the watching circle. Someone stepped forward, then stopped, unsure whether they were allowed to approach. He did not look up, but he did not stop them either. Hands reached out, cautious, reverent. Fingers touched the surface and recoiled instinctively. It was cold in a way memory alone could not explain. He cleared more. The block was smaller now, perhaps half the size of what had gone in 18 months earlier. Its edges were smooth, its clarity slightly clouded at the core, but it was solid, alive with cold. When he struck it lightly with the iron tool, it answered not with a crack, but with a ringing note that traveled up the handle and into the air. That sound broke something open in the town. It was no longer a question of whether it worked. The pit had spoken for itself. The sawdust, so long dismissed, had done exactly what he believed it would do. Time had passed. Seasons had turned. Heat had pressed in from every direction. And still, here it was. 18 months. He did not announce the number. Someone else said it aloud, voice low, as if afraid the sound might disturb the balance. Another repeated it, then another. The number moved through the group like a slow tide, carrying with it awe, disbelief, and something deeper humility. Questions followed, but they were different now. They were not challenges. They were requests. How much had been lost? How much remained? What had mattered most? He answered honestly. He spoke of margins, of sacrifice, of the importance of not fighting heat directly, but giving it no path. He emphasized that nothing here was perfect, that the system worked because it respected limits instead of denying them. He explained how the sawdust did not create cold, it preserved it. How insulation was not about strength but stillness. How impatience would undo everything faster than sunlight ever could. These were not secrets. They were lessons learned slowly, paid for with effort and restraint. Someone asked if it could be done on a larger scale. He paused then. Not because he doubted it, but because he understood the weight of the question. Larger meant shared. Shared meant responsibility. It meant teaching without controlling, trusting others to care as deeply as he had. It meant letting go of something that had been his alone. He said it could be done, but not easily. That success would depend less on materials than on discipline. That shortcuts would fail. That everyone involved would need to accept loss as part of the process. The pit was not emptied that day. He removed only what was necessary to show the truth, then replaced the layers with the same care as always. The cover went back on. The stones were set. The cold was returned to darkness. People lingered long after the work was finished. They spoke quietly among themselves, recalculating futures they had never imagined. Ice in summer had been a marvel. Ice beyond a year was a transformation. That evening, the town felt different. Not celebratory, but sober. Certain things had shifted out of place, and no one knew yet how they would settle. Old knowledge had not been destroyed, but it had been demoted. In the days that followed, sawdust stopped being treated as waste. Mills stored it carefully. People argued over who had access to it. Children were scolded for throwing it away. A material once ignored now carried possibility. The man returned to his routines, though he knew nothing would be the same. He had not set out to change the town. He had only followed an idea to its conclusion. But conclusions have consequences. Winter would come again. Summer would follow. The seasons would continue their endless argument with the land. But now, between them, there was a pause of space where understanding could intervene. And deep beneath the ground, insulated by patience and humility, the remaining ice waited, no longer an experiment, but a fact the town could not unlearn. The weeks after the demonstration passed with a strange, restrained energy, like the moment after a storm when everything stands intact but no one trusts the calm. The pit was sealed again, the ice returned to its quiet vigil underground, yet its presence lingered everywhere. It lived in conversations that trailed off mid-sentence, in glances toward the mill where sawdust now lay stacked and protected instead of scattered and burned, in the way people hesitated before dismissing an idea simply because it sounded unfamiliar. Man felt it most sharply in the silence. Before, silence around him had meant indifference or mockery waiting to surface. Now it was something heavier. People watched him work with an intensity that made even simple actions feel instructive. When he repaired a fence, someone asked why he chose one board over another. When he adjusted the drainage near his shed, someone wanted to know how deep was deep enough. He answered when he could, but more often he found himself saying nothing, not out of secrecy, but because he understood how easily explanation could turn into instruction without comprehension. Understanding took time. He had learned that the hard way. Requests came next, and they did not all sound the same. Some were polite, framed as curiosity. Some were urgent, edged with fear of future summers. A few were blunt, almost demanding, as if the pit had become public property by virtue of its success. People spoke of shared ice houses, of collective labor, of ensuring no one went without again. These were good intentions, he knew, but intentions alone had never preserved anything. He listened, as he always did. The town council eventually approached him, though they avoided calling it that. It was just a group of men and women standing near his fence one evening, speaking carefully, weighing words as if each carried a cost. They talked about fairness, about planning, about how much easier it would be if everyone followed the same method. He did not refuse them outright. That would have been simple, and simplicity was no longer honest. Instead, he asked questions. Who would be responsible for maintenance? Who would decide when ice could be taken and when it must be left alone? Who would accept loss without looking for blame? Their answers were uncertain. They spoke of committees, of shared duty, of trust. He nodded, knowing how fragile those things became under pressure. That night, he opened his notebook for the first time in months. It was nothing impressive, just bound pages filled with dates, measurements, small sketches of cross-sections and layers. Notes on moisture, on compaction, on how many times the pit had been opened during the hottest weeks. It was a record not of success, but of restraint. Looking at it now, he realized something he had not fully acknowledged before. The pit had worked because he had treated it like a living thing. He had responded to it, adjusted to it, respected its limits. Could a group do the same? The town, meanwhile, was learning its own lessons. A few more private pits appeared, dug hastily in backyards and fields. Some people followed his visible example, but skipped the unseen discipline. They piled ice too loosely. They used sawdust that was damp or mixed with rot. They opened their pits too often, eager for reassurance. When their ice vanished within months, frustration spread quickly. They came to him with complaints disguised as questions. Why did it work for them? What had they missed? He told them the truth, gently but firmly. They had treated the pit like a container, not a system, like an object, not a relationship. Insulation was not a spell you cast once and forgot. It was a promise you kept every day. Not everyone appreciated that answer. Some accused him of holding something back, of exaggerating the difficulty to maintain control, of enjoying the position he had never sought. The irony did not escape him. He had been mocked for believing too much, and now he was suspected of believing too little in others. Still, change continued. The mill adapted first. Sawdust was no longer dumped carelessly. It was dried, sorted, stored under cover. The mill owner, a practical man with little patience for philosophy, recognized value when it proved itself. He began selling sawdust by weight, and people paid gladly. What had once been swept away now demanded respect. Children absorbed the shift faster than anyone. They asked different questions now. Why was snow warmer than bare ground? Why did cellars stay cool? Why did wind matter more than sun? These were not new facts, but now they were asked aloud. The answers, when found, began to reshape how the next generation looked at the world. Autumn deepened into winter again, and with it came the second full cycle since the pit as creation. This time, ice cutting felt different. It was no longer an oddity to see large blocks hauled from the lake. Several people joined him, some clumsy, some careful, all watching closely. He corrected mistakes when they threatened safety or quality, but otherwise he let them learn through effort. The sound of ice being scored and freed echoed across the frozen surface, and something about it felt communal now. Not because it belonged to everyone, but because it no longer belonged only to him. They rebuilt the pit that winter, not larger, but stronger. Reinforced supports, better drainage channels, thicker insulation layers where experience had shown weakness. He allowed the changes, guided them subtly, never issuing orders. When asked why something mattered, he explained. When asked to decide, he deferred, forcing others to confront the weight of choice. Responsibility changed people. Spring returned, and this time it did not bring mockery or awe. It brought routine. The pit was opened according to schedule, inspected, resealed. Ice was removed sparingly. Loss was recorded without accusation. The system held, not because it was perfect, but because it was respected. Yet tension lingered. Success had raised expectations, and expectations are heavy things. Some wanted expansion, bigger pits, more ice, broader distribution. Others worried about dependency, about what would happen if one season failed badly enough to starve the system. Old arguments resurfaced in new forms. Control versus access. Individual care versus collective reach. The man found himself caught between worlds. He had never wanted to be a leader, yet his knowledge placed him at the center of decisions that mattered. He felt the pull of two instincts: to protect the system by limiting it, and to honor its potential by sharing it fully. One evening, after a particularly long discussion that ended without resolution, he returned alone to the pit. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the ground. He removed the cover just enough to feel the breath of cold rise and meet his face. It was steady, reliable, familiar. He realized then that the pit was not the achievement people thought it was. The real change had already happened. The pit had simply revealed it. People were thinking differently now. They questioned waste. They observed patterns. They accepted that understanding could come from quiet attention rather than tradition. Even if the pit vanished tomorrow, those shifts would remain. That thought eased something inside him. When the town met again, he spoke more openly than before. He told them he would help build more pits, but only if each group accepted responsibility for its own. He refused central control. He insisted on shared learning rather than uniform rules. Failure, he said, would be as important as success. Some resisted. Some agreed reluctantly. A few embraced the idea immediately. And so the work spread not quickly, not cleanly, but honestly. By the time the next summer arrived, the town held several functioning pits, each slightly different, each shaped by the people who tended it. Some performed better than others. All taught lessons. Ice no longer belonged to one man or one place. It belonged to a way of thinking. On the hottest day of that summer, when the air shimmered and even the lake seemed exhausted, children gathered near one of the pits. They watched as a small block of ice was lifted and carried away, steam curling faintly around it as if the world itself were surprised. None of them laughed. They had grown up knowing that cold could last if treated with respect. That waste could become shelter. That patience could outlast heat. And far from the center of attention, the man stood back, hands resting on the fence, content not because he had been proven right, but because the town no longer needed him to be. Years passed, and the story softened the way all true stories do. Its edges blurred, its sharp moments rounded by repetition and memory, until it no longer felt like a disruption but like something that had always belonged to the town. People still spoke of the first pit, of course, but they did so the way one speaks of a beginning rather than a miracle. It became a reference point, not a spectacle. The man grew older quietly. His hair thinned, his steps slowed, but his habits remained unchanged. He rose early, he worked deliberately. He observed more than he spoke. The pits no longer just one, but several scattered across the land continued to function, each tended by different hands, each reflecting the temperament of those who cared for it. Some were meticulous, sealed tight, and opened rarely. Others were more generous, trading efficiency for accessibility. All of them held ice longer than anyone once believed possible. Summer after summer, the town felt less afraid. Heat still came, heavy and demanding, but it no longer carried the same threat. Food lasted. Illness declined. Markets stabilized. Small changes compounded into something durable. People planned further ahead. They wasted less. They argued less fiercely about scarcity because scarcity no longer felt inevitable. Children who had once laughed at the Sawdust pit grew into adults who had never known a world without stored ice. To them, the idea that cold vanished completely each summer sounded strange, almost careless. They accepted insulation as instinctively as their parents had accepted loss. When asked why something worked, they did. T shrugged, they explained. When they did know, they experimented. The town's relationship with waste transformed in subtle but lasting ways. Sawdust was only the beginning. Straw, leaves, ash materials once discarded were reconsidered. People asked what each thing could do before deciding it was useless. Not everything found a purpose, but nothing was dismissed without thought. That habit alone reshaped how they lived. The man watched this shift with a mixture of pride and detachment. He had never intended to teach, yet teaching had happened anyway. Not through instruction, but through example. He understood now that the pit had succeeded not because it stored ice, but because it stored attention. It had demanded care, patience, and restraint qualities that once practiced tended to spread. As his strength waned, he passed responsibility without ceremony. Younger hands took over the heaviest tasks. Others maintained records, improving on his simple notes with better measurements and clearer diagrams. They refined drainage systems, experimented with pit shapes, tested different insulation densities. Some innovations failed. Others succeeded spectacularly. The system evolved, no longer dependent on any one mind, and with that evolution came distance. The story began to drift away from him. People still nodded respectfully when they passed his house, still acknowledged his role, but fewer came seeking answers. They had their own now. He felt no resentment in this, only relief. To be needed is heavy. To be surpassed is light. One autumn evening, long after the first pit had been dug, he walked slowly to its site. It had been reinforced over the years, expanded slightly, improved in ways he recognized and others he did not. He ran his hand along the weathered boards, feeling the grain raised by time. Beneath his feet, cold waited patiently as it always had. He did not open it. There was nothing left to prove. He sat nearby as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. He thought about the winter when people had laughed, about the spring when doubt cracked, about the summer when envy replaced mockery, about the day the 18th month arrived and silence fell like snow. Each moment felt distant now, less like memory and more like landscape features of a life lived attentively. When he eventually passed, there was no grand announcement, no monument built. The town mourned him quietly, the way it had learned to do many things without waste. Someone suggested naming a pit after him. Others disagreed. His influence, they said, did belong to a single structure. It belonged to the way they thought now. The pits continued. Generations changed. Tools improved. New materials arrived, new methods layered atop the old. Some people forgot the specifics of how the first pit had been built. They argued over details, misremembered timelines, embellished motivations. Stories grew. That was inevitable. But the core truth remained untouched. Ice could last. Not because someone had forced it to, but because someone had listened long enough to understand how. On especially hot days, when the air shimmered and cicadas sang themselves hoarse, elders would tell children about a time when summer meant surrender, when food spoiled quickly, when cold was a memory instead of a resource. The children listened politely but with skepticism. To them, such a world felt as distant as a myth. That was the real legacy, not the pits, not the ice, but the quiet undoing of inevitability. The town had learned that many limits were not laws, only habits waiting to be questioned. That progress did not always arrive loud or fast, and that ridicule was often just fear wearing a familiar face. They had learned to look twice at simple things, to ask what else they might be capable of if treated with care. And beneath the ground, season after season, ice continued to wait smaller each year, perhaps, but never entirely gone. A reminder buried deep and insulated well that patience, once practiced, could outlast heat, doubt, and even time itself.